and he is going to be speaking on the politicization of women in Islamic cultures, competing conceptions of freedom and justice. Rizwan Sam.
I think first of all I should explain what's the relevance of my topic given the structure of the seminar and the can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. So on the surface the title of this talk has hardly anything to do with the broader theme of the seminar, yet it seems to me that the topic is relevant for us to ponder over, and I'll explain why. What I intend to do here is to map a particular discourse that has proceeded in Muslim societies and is an example of a cultural discourse, the cultural discourse about freedom and women rights, feminism, and at the broadest level, role of women in Islamic cultures. My assumption is that there is much to be gained by tracing the socio-political and historical origins and development of this discourse. There is really much to learn from it. I also think that many other cultural discourses would share a similar narrative and similar cultural consequences. To observe carefully this discourse is to become sensitive to these other discourses as well. A word about the title of my talk, Politicization, which of course means to bring a political character or flavor to something, make political. On another day, I would have tweaked the English language a bit to call it ideologization of Muslim women in Islamic cultures. But I don't know, I'm not a native speaker, so I would not try that. The thesis of the talk is simple and straightforward. The discourse and debate about the role of women, Muslim women in Islamic societies is hardly about Muslim women themselves and their well-being, but is in fact simply a rallying point of competing ideologies and worldviews. What is at stake for these contending ideologies or worldviews is simply to dominate the other perspectives. The welfare of women does not seem to be at the forefront of their agenda. I'm a little low on energy. I would have otherwise said it has nothing to do with women. The discourse about women has nothing whatsoever to do with women. So this is all I have to say in the whole talk, is to try to make a case for it. To bring this thesis out, I would draw a lot from major studies on women issues in Islamic societies that have appeared in last few decades. The subtitle, Competing Conceptions of Freedom of Justice, I hope to get to, but might not eventually be able to because of time constraint or other problems. But I hope to at least hint at it. You'll have to bear with me because today I have a lot of quotes from you. It is not all that pleasant for ears to hear these extensive quotes. It takes too much energy at the expense of interest and attention. Yet, because my analysis relies heavily on this language of the discourse, what it reveals and what it oftentimes conceals or hides, for my task it seemed inevitable to read to you actual quotes simply because my point is to track down and build my argument upon the way and the manner in which the discourse about Muslim women has originated and continues to this day. To this end, I cannot but highlight the actual language used and the categories employed. Finally, a word on the map of the talk itself. First, I'll describe the origins of this specific debate about Muslim women as it has come down to us today. Second, I'll lay out the various interlocutors of the debate who helped set it up, shaped it over decades, and formed it for us. On the way, I'll analyze the concerns, the aims, and objectives of each interlocutor and what seems to be in stake for them in this debate. Finally, I'll also shed some light on their respective notions of freedom and justice and their hermeneutical interpretive methods of approaching the Islamic tradition of scholarship and scriptural sources. By way of conclusion, I'll reflect on what is there for us to learn from our mapping of this discourse. Minimally, if I am able to convince you that the discourse about women is not really about women and about something else, this in itself, I hope, should raise enough question marks for us, and I'll be much content with it. All right, so genealogies of the discourse, the historical context, the origins of the debate. When did it begin, why, how, and how has it proceeded? Origins of the debate. Now, historians of Muslim feminism, people like Strasser, Leila Ahmed, and a couple of others, have consensus that the origins of the debate, the specific debate that we have today in Islamic cultures about Muslim women, began during the colonial period. European colonialism, not simply in subcontinent India, but also in Egypt and other Islamic societies. What must also be noted that this is also the beginning of the politicization of the issue, and we'll get to it. In a sense, my whole talk is on this one singular quote that I'm about to present to you, and I'll break it down, but let me state it at the outset. Women's seclusion and veiling in Muslim societies acquired multiple symbolic meanings when the Western colonialist establishments, although themselves patriarchal, began to attack these traditions as primary reason for Muslim backwardness and the obstacle to their progress toward true civilization, that is, their remaking in the Western world. Western missionaries and feminists further strengthened this imperialist formula, which resulted in a fusion of Muslim women issues with Islamic culture as a whole. The formula acquired an inner Islamic class dimension when indigenous but westernized upper class intellectuals such as Qasim Amin criticized traditional, that is lower class Muslim society by focusing on women issues while using the foreigner's language on the inferiority of Muslim traditions and the superiority of the West. The indigenous Islamic response of resistance was as complex as the original challenge. It embodied the call to pitch Islamic cultural authenticity formulated in terms of Islamic morality against foreign colonialism, neo-colonialism, and their pseudo-Muslim westernized mouthpieces. True to the challenge, however, the focus of the debate remained on women issues, especially female domestic seclusion and the veil, as symbol of the validity and dignity of Muslim tradition as a whole. All right, so I'll break it down just in case if you lost me or I lost you while reading it out. So here's the argument. During the colonial period of Islamic societies, Western colonialist establishment attacked Muslims for being backward. From white man's superior civilizational standpoint, Muslims were of an inferior civilization and culture, and one of the primary reasons for this is the way they treat their women. What is bad from the point of view of Muslims' treatment of their women? Women's seclusion and veiling. So, this seclusion of women and veiling became a sign and constant confirmation of Islamic society's backwardness from their point of view. That Muslim women were veiled and secluded was a symptom of oppression, and this oppression has nothing cultural or ethnic about it. It's not because we are Indian or Punjabis or Sindhis, that's why we oppress women. It's because we are Muslims and Islam teaches us to oppress women. That's why they get oppressed. So there's a direct identification of the problem with the religion itself from the point of view of the colonial establishment. If Muslims were to progress, and of course progress meant in Western model and Western model alone, Muslim women need to be freed from the oppression of veil and seclusion. Under pressure from these Western groups, two sorts of responses emerged. First, the upper class westernized Muslims who used the language and categories of thinking of Western colonial establishment itself, accepting the inferiority of Muslim civilization and superiority of the Western civilization, and attempted to reform Muslim societies by trying to, quote unquote, liberate women. Response from ulama and later the so-called fundamentalists. I mean, I don't know a better term for fundamentalists, we can debate about it, but we know what we are talking about, which simultaneously reacted to both the colonial establishment, but even more so, the westernized elite, trying to show that Muslims were not inferior, Islam is not backward, it's not oppressive to women, and West is not necessarily superior. Thus the quote, it embodied the call to pitch Islamic cultural authenticity formulated in terms of Islamic morality against foreign colonialism, neo-colonialism, and their pseudo-Muslim westernized mouthpieces. In concrete terms, just the way the situation of women in Islamic societies was from the point of view of Westerners, a symbol of Islamic religion's backward and oppressive character, from the point of view of these Muslims, if Muslim women were proved oppressed, Islam proves to be the oppressor. To prove that Muslim women are empowered was to show that Islam is progressive and Islam is the agent of empowerment of women. Saving the dignity of Muslim women is thus saving the dignity of Islam. Right? That's the response. Not the upper westernized response, but the so-called ulama, the lower class, the Strasser is making a class distinction, upper class, thinking in Western terms, using their categories, trying to criticize the lower class, the folk culture of the Islamic societies, and this is the response. Thus, it meant attacking from lower class, it meant attacking the claims for superiority of the West by attempting to show that Islam is much more liberating than Western thinking and lifestyles, and Muslim women are much more empowered in Islam than in the West. Now, although what is being debated are the issues surrounding women's roles in the society, yet what is really at stake for all interlocutors is whether Islam is progressive or backward, rational or tradition stuck, liberating or oppressive. Now, so this is the argument that Strasser is making. And now I'll simply elaborate on this argument by providing concrete examples from each side, all the interlocutors in the debate. So the actors in setting up the debate, the colonial establishment, Lord Cromer, who was in India, later went to Egypt, writes in 1898, look now to the consequences which result from the degradation of women in Muhammadan countries. In respect to 2 points, both of which are of vital importance, there is a radical difference between the position of Muslim women and that of their European sisters. In the first place, the face of the Muslim woman is veiled when she appears in public. She lives a life of seclusion. The face of the European woman is exposed to view in public. The only restraint placed on her movements are those dictated by her own sense of propriety. In the second place, the East is polygamous. The West is monogamous. He further stated that the effects of polygamy are more baneful and far-reaching than those of seclusion. The whole fabric of the European society rests upon the preservation of family life. Monogamy fosters family life, polygamy destroys it. Cromer, 1908, volume 2, whatever, citation. Muslim women are, so what's going on here? Muslim women are compared to Western women. The problem with Muslim women is seclusion, polygamy, and veiling. It proves that European women are much better off than the Muslim women. And also notice that what is being compared is women of a religion versus women of a region. European women versus Muhammadan, Islamic, Muslim women. The second interlocutor, missionaries. Watson, writing in 1898, in the West, woman is honored. In Egypt, she is despised. If a man should find it necessary to refer to his wife, he'll seldom say my wife or call her by her name, Maryam, or whatever it may be, but will say the family or the company. And if he should say my wife, he will likely add, may God preserve thee from dishonor. Indeed, it is quite the general opinion in Egypt that a woman has a lower nature than a man, and I have often heard the expression from men of intelligence and position, the woman race is all bad, none of them can be trusted. The men treat them generally as they do menials or those who are on a lower plane of existence, as if they were created only for man's comfort and ease. There is little difference in this respect in Egypt between Muslims and so-called Christians. The native Egyptian Christians, such as the Copts and Catholics, seem to have adopted in their homes many of the social habits of the Mohammedans and become thoroughly filled with Mohammedan ideas of woman's inferiority and woman's special depravity. Again and again, in urging the men to teach their women, they have replied, they cannot learn, they are donkeys. Now, again note that whatever is wrong with the situation of Egyptian women is a function of their religion. If Coptic Christians have similar problems, it is because they have adopted Islamic ways of life, not the Egyptian ways of life, but the Islamic ways of life. Now we turn to the westernized upper class. People like Qasim Amin, who apparently in the feminist literature is seen as the first liberator of women. So he's writing now, look at the Eastern countries. You will find women enslaved to man and man to the ruler. Man is an oppressor in his home, oppressed as soon as he leaves it. Then look at the European countries. The governments are based on freedom and respect for personal rights, and the status of women has been raised to a high degree of respect and freedom of thought and action. Now there's long arguments, but I want to state them because they keep popping up for 100. So if you look at one, you've looked at almost all. The status of women is inseparably tied to the status of a nation. When the status of a nation is low, reflecting an uncivilized condition for that nation, the status of women is also low. And when the status of a nation is elevated, reflecting the progress and civilization of that nation, the status of the status of that nation also elevated, we find that the women in nations with the more advanced civilization have gradually advanced from the low status to which they had been relegated and have started to overcome the gap that has separated them from men. These discrepancies among civilized nations reflect the different societies to which these women belong and the level of civilization of these societies. The American woman is in the forefront, followed by the British, the German, the French, the Austrian, the Italian, and the Russian women, and so on. He had the complete list. I cut off. I took a few out. According to him, it is because of the years of tyrant rulers who have made force the way, I think there is a misprint. Anyhow, the way to everything, even in family affairs, is what has made women suffer in the Islamic societies. We have observed that women at present have more freedom to look after their own affairs, that they quite often go to the public parks in order to take the fresh air and to see the works of the sublime creator displayed for the eyes of all humans, whether male or female. This is a new kind of respect for them. So something of a change is being witnessed by Qasim Amin. What brought the change? The change is a consequence of the increased intellectual development of men and the moderation of their rulers. Yet criticism is still needed. Among the most important of these are the family established tradition of wailing among the majority of the population and the inadequate socialization of the women. Were women's socialization affected with religious and moral principles, and were the use of the veil terminated at limits familiar in most Islamic schools of belief, then these criticisms would be dropped and our country would benefit from the active participation of all its citizens, men and women alike. How are we doing on time, by the way? Half done? Are you serious? Okay. So I'll skip a few. Anyhow, so he says, Qasim Amin goes on to state that though many intellectual and social reforms were made, but one factor escaped everyone's attention. If Egyptians want to reform their current situation, they must begin with the roots of reform. In the end, he says, reform this, reform, eventually reform women, educate them, liberate them, unveil them, send them out. Then writes, in 1905, this is a classic quote, my personal favorite. Writing in Ottoman Lebanon, daughter of a high-ranking judge, the book is called Unveiling and Veiling, written in 1927. The unveiled nations are the ones that have discovered through research and study the secrets of nature and have brought the physical elements under their control, as you see and know. But the veiled nations have not unearthed any secret and have not put any of the physical elements under their control, but only sing the songs of a glorious past and ancient traditions. With such singing, they sleep in stagnation. I cannot imagine that in the advanced nations which have discovered the secrets of nature and harnessed its powers, which have not let anything pass without examining it to the fullest, where the struggle between the right and wrong is continuous until right becomes victorious. Nations which have produced works on social subjects we view as masterpieces of literature and sociology have neglected to study veiling and unveiling to understand the advantages and disadvantages. Then she says, don't you see that polygamy has become considered evil by the enlightened communities to be read as the West around us and the great independent Islamic nation of Turkey post Kemal Atatürk, Turkey. So not the Ottoman Turkey. Now, if I were to draw, what points emerge from these quotes? West superiority and East or Islamic society's backwardness is simultaneously acknowledged, and the prescription is to imitate Western ways of life. Reforms to liberate Muslim women are modeled after the West. What needs reform is polygamy, veiling, and seclusion. In a sense, if polygamy is abolished, veils lifted, and seclusion ended, the societies would prosper and our civilization would proceed forward. The issue is not so much what to do with women, but how to progress and how to become more civilized. And true civilization, enlightenment, were the widespread concerns of those days. You can read any literature, rise and fall of civilization. This was a major theme. Everyone was thinking about it and writing about that. It's really catching up with the West that is driving the project. Further, I should mention that the aim of this project is to free men and women through scientific education so that they could create a durable civilization. The concept of freedom itself is modeled after the West. To be free is to be able to do what one thinks is right. So personal freedom, nothing like a tradition or custom or ethnicity, no such bindings should prevent individuals' right to assert oneself. To me, it seems that the real impetus for politicization of Muslim women came from this camp simply because they had tied the status of women to the other and more complicated issues like backwardness of Muslims, the decline and decadence of their civilization. Had the issue of Muslim women not directly linked to these concerns, not much politicization would have happened. So they made the first move. So they started the process. Now, I mean, I'll leave it to you. I mean, is it really about repairing women's situation or something else is driving this project? Now, the indigenous Islamic response of resistance and stimulated rebuttals. The response of ulama and Islamic groups later on, Islamic groups. In the face of the challenge of the colonizing superior power of the West and the westernized upper elite, both sharing common basis for critique built on the shared worldview and passing derogatory remarks on Islamic traditions, indigenous response emerged. We know that both Qasim Amin and Nazra were strongly criticized and their works were very controversial. But why? Simply because he was seeking emancipation of women or of the society? In Qasim Amin's own words, upon publication of my work, The Liberation of Women, legal scholars decided that it was an offense to Islam. And many graduates from the madrasas saw it an exaggerated imitation of the West. Some of them went as far as to say that it is a crime against the country and against religion. If in their writings they were even so deluded as to say that the liberation of Eastern women was something that the Christian nations were striving for in order to destroy them, and that any Muslim who supports women's liberation is not in fact a Muslim. So let me quote again. Stosser was saying that Qasim Amin is using a foreigner's language on the inferiority of the Muslim traditions and the superiority of the West, and that's what is being, Qasim Amin is himself admitting that that's what's causing the trouble. From this point of view, the use of Western categories was symptom of Western hegemony that was now threatening the Islamic norms, morals, and the religion itself. This discourse was seen as coercive and an attempt to undermine Islam itself. The debate about women roles from the point of view of these people has become the issue of resistance to Western oppression and hegemony over the discourse, the culture norms of Muslims, and their religious identity. Now, already we noticed that the Western conceptions of Islam and Muslim women's plight has been a silent partner in the conversation. Western perceptions of Islam are looming large in the background of this debate. So I think it's important we pay attention to where is that coming from. Not so much, but what are their sources? It will take, multiple works have been written on perceptions of Islam and why they are in this particular way. This is not the place to go into it. So Layla Ahmed writes, Americans know and know without even having to think about it that the Islamic peoples, Arabs, Iranians, whatever they call themselves, are backward, uncivilized peoples, totally incapable of rational conduct. This is overwhelmingly the attitude of the media and of the society at large, and also, unfortunately, often that of the smaller groups supposedly representing American informed opinion. Just as Americans know that Arabs are backward, they know also with the same flawless certainty that Muslim women are terribly oppressed and degraded. And they know this not because they know that women everywhere in the world are oppressed, but because they believe that specifically Islam monstrously oppresses women. But there are, of course, those powerfully evocative words for Westerners, haram, the veil, the polygamy, all of which are almost synonymous in this country with female oppression. Thus, American women know that Muslim women are overwhelmingly oppressed without being able to define the specific content of that oppression in the same way that they know that Muslims, Arab, Iranians, or whatever are ignorant, backward, irrational, and uncivilized. These are facts manufactured in Western culture by the same men who have also littered the culture with facts about Western women and how inferior and irrational they are. And for centuries, the Muslim world has been systematically falsifying and vilifying the Muslim world. Gist of the critique, the assumed irrational, oppressive, and uncivilized characterization of Islam as a religion, when juxtaposed with the position of women that all women in all traditional societies are oppressed, elicits an even more problematic picture from Western point of view regarding the condition of Muslim women. Basit, time 15 minutes हो गए रह गए अच्छा. Now, so two elements First, I mentioned what is the source of misperception in the West. First, Islam itself. Anything, it's a nice recipe, if you add Islam onto something, it becomes problematic. So if you add it to women who are already oppressed, more oppression automatically happens. So this is one aspect. The second source, and that goes back, I mean, I'm using Saba Mahmood's, it's almost classic now, anthropological work on politics of piety. And she notices that Western liberal, and usually feminists are surprised and quite uncomfortable with the active engagement of Muslim women in Islamist and Islamist-like projects. She is talking about mosque, piety-minded Muslim women meeting in mosque and discussing religious affairs, and it's becoming a huge movement in Cairo. She witnessed it as an anthropologist and documented it, and that's the analysis based on her work. So they pursue practices and ideals embedded within a tradition that has historically accorded women a subordinate status. How could Muslim women be part of a movement in an activity that is historically bound with women oppression, which is a male activity? That's the question which Western feminists cannot get her head around. And since there is something intrinsic to women that should predispose them to oppose the practices, values, and injunctions that the Islamic movement embodies, she asks, why liberal feminists have to make this assumption? By focusing on the mosque movements in Egypt, Saba Mahmood speaks back to the normative liberal assumption about human nature against which such a movement is held accountable, such as the belief that all human beings have an innate desire for freedom, that we all somehow seek to assert our assert our autonomy when allowed to do so, that human agency primarily consists of acts that challenge social norms. Back to the same issue. Literature as rebellion. So here, how come they are not rebelling against these male-dominated institutions? The notion of human agency and freedom invoked by feminists in the West locates agency in the political and moral autonomy of the subject. The free person is one who has both negative and positive freedom. Negative freedom, no external constraint; positive freedom, freedom to be able to assert one's own will and do what one wills. Freedom in this perspective is individual autonomy, constraint free choices that would lead to self-realization. For an individual to be free, her actions must be the consequences of her own will rather than of custom, tradition, or social coercion. Within this perspective, freedom of women would imply resistance to all hegemonic forces, those imposed by dominant males or by custom tradition. Thus, freedom implies resistance to subjugation of individual will to any other will, be it human or divine. This particular construction of what it means to be free and autonomous obviously leaves out all other conceptions of freedom and the pathways prescribed to it. And we'll look at a couple of them later on in the talk. So, just to sum up this section on Western perception, veiling is oppression because it gives, from the Western point of view, veiling is oppression because it gives an impression of conformity, of subjection to tribal, ethnic, or religious code at the expense of freedom of an individual to choose what he or she wills to choose. From the theological point of view, this seems quite a mystical notion of freedom, actually. In a sense, a mystic, Wali, Sufi, in his actor of willing is somehow automatically willing what God wills. So he doesn't need any external constraint. So without treading any spiritual path, you already have that will which is aligned with the divine will. So anything you choose is good by itself. You don't need any object of, whether the object of will is good or bad, that's not even a question. So it's a very mystical notion of freedom in that sense. So while Western studies identify the veil as symbol of resistance, Saba Mahmood is writing this, to the commodification of women's bodies in the media and more generally to the hegemony of Western values, it is surprising that their authors have paid so little attention to Islamic virtues of female modesty or piety, especially given that many of the women who have taken up the veil frame their decision precisely in these terms. They cannot comprehend veiling could be an act of pious concern. I want to be obedient to God and submit to God's will, and that's why I'm wearing the veil. That doesn't trigger anything. So why piety as motivation for veiling does not attract for us a serious consideration, that's a question she leaves us with. Well, I mean, leaves them with, not us, maybe some of us here. Conclusion so far. So now two things, Islamophobia on the one hand and a culturally particular conception of freedom on the other together underlie Western assumption of Muslim women and their condition. Now, time basis बताएं जान दियो conclusion so far and contemporary status. So what I've discussed so far is the origin of the debate and some developments, and let's now see where we are. Once politicized in the early colonial period, the previous part, the cultural discourse about women has failed to depoliticize. With time, the fusion of Muslim women's issues with Islamic culture as a whole has deepened. The selective focus of this debate is itself a symptom of politicization, especially in this phase of the debate: veiling, polygamy, and segregation of sexes. Thus, Muslim public intellectuals among themselves, and increasingly in reaction to the competing perspective discussed women in Islam, laying out their particular theological, juridical, and hermeneutical commitments without ever directly debating or conversing with one another. So the three camps I talked about, they are writing, responding to one another, but never directly talking to one another. Instead, the broader society had to face the push and pull of these debates in which the various participants had refused to directly engage and confront the other side. What emerges from here are groups whose hermeneutical and ideological commitments on the issues surrounding the debate on women in Islam would persist to this day, from the origin to the present day, with slight modifications here and there. And there are, of course, marginal figures, which I am not discussing, who have provided kind of a cut through these divides, but they are marginal, so that's not my concern today. Hardening of position on all sides, reactionary debate, Muslim liberals much critical of the traditional mindset, and traditional ulama extremely skeptic of the intentions, and almost always perceive these liberal responses culturally and religiously inauthentic as either West toxification or complete submission to covert Western agenda, fully accepting its superiority, and complete detachment from Islamic teachings and cultural identity. Thus, Western perception and misperceptions are intrinsic part of this ongoing debate, which Muslims continue to respond to and react to: apologetics, defensive theological claims, harsh criticism of Western society's moral norms, and often are inspired with, like in the case of Qasim Amin, latest developments in the feminist literature that has come up in the West. And of course, that creates more reaction from other side, and the discourse continues, politicization continues. For example, Fatima Marnisi, she's a well-known feminist. She's using the language of subjugation, control, which are new categories in the feminist literature. And then Sheikh Qardawi, I don't know if you've heard about him, an Egyptian scholar who's on TV all the time. I don't know if I have time, otherwise I'll read certain quotes from him. How, writing in 1990s, it's again, all these issues are the same. It is common talk that Muslim women constitute half the society, and that the society should not neglect them, leave them idle, maltreat them, nor dissolve their rights. We are Muslims first and foremost. We do not sell our religion in imitation of the vagaries of Western or Easterns. Our religion forbids us from promiscuous mixing with its showiness and seductiveness. He writes, in addition, the West itself, enamored by this idea, is suffering the consequences of dissipation and decaying that has corrupted its youth and doomed its civilization to ruin and collapse. Unfortunately, some people calling for westernization in our Arab and Islamic countries have made use of what has happened, because of the Muslims who transgress. They raise their voices asking for polygamy to be abolished completely. Day and night, the advantages of polygamy are reiterated, while silence is kept about the disadvantages of adultery and fabrication, which is unfortunately allowed by local laws which rule over Muslim states nowadays. The missionary and Orientalist invasion of the previous age focused its attack on two issues and meant to decry the Islamic attitude concerning women. These are divorce and polygamy, though in fact they are two of the good things Islam is proud of. Now, apologetic, a defense of Islamic tradition, or an attack on the West, howsoever we want to label it, it hardly goes beyond the objections and critiques of the West and the westernized polygamy, veiling, seclusion again and again. I hope it is clear from this how and why veiling and now headscarf are not simply a religious issue, but part of religious, cultural, and even political identity, motivated by not simply religious and pious concerns. And here I have a very interesting example. Just yesterday, I saw a rickshaw, सियालकोट के पास, रिक्शे के पीछे लिखा हुआ था स्कार्फ स्कूल. और उसमें छोटी सी लड़की, बच्चियों का स्कूल है, वो 6-7 साल की बच्ची की रक्षे के ऊपर तस्वीर है, उसने स्कार्फ पहना हुआ है. Whereas this scarf was one of the prescriptions of Islam among like 100,000. Now scarf is defining what Islam is. अगर आपको इस्लामिक स्कूल चाहिए तो ये स्कार्फ हम पहनाते हैं, इधर भिजवा दें. ठीक है? It comes back to veiling, to scarf. Headscarf is new in the issue of veiling, but it's still the issue of veiling again. So all three discourses that have led to the politicization of this debate around women continue to develop, sometimes in isolation. I've made this point. Now, I had the Muslim responses, the three paradigms, what their concerns are, what motivates them, and what their hermeneutical strategies are. I can skip this. And let me turn to, so what we get in regards to veil, there is a veil which is put on as a resistance. There is a veil which is mark of identity, religious identity. It's also, I mean, veil is also resistant to secular nation state like Turkey. Veil as piety, modesty, and veil as oppression from Western and Westernized. So there are these different associations with this one issue of veil, simply based on how we see Islam and religion and religion's prescriptions. So conclusions. It is almost ironic, but hopefully clear, that why even today the question of the degree of freedom of women is gauged through issues like polygamy, segregation of genders, and veiling by all. These might not be the only yardsticks, but they do dominate the discourse still, especially in Western consciousness, and increasingly so in the Islamic countries. On the Western side of the issue, West would continue to be the silent and not so silent partner in the conversation. Veiling still and will continue to be oppression from their point of view. So will be polygamy and seclusion. So if we are really trying to impress them, it's not going to work. I don't think so. The question that Sabah Mahmood asked is really interesting. That she writes, it was the burqa-clad body of the Afghan woman and not the destruction wrought by 20 years of war in Afghanistan that served as the primary referent in the feminist majority's vast mobilization against the Taliban regime. While the denial of education to Afghan women and the restrictions imposed on their movements are often noted, it was the condensed and organized knowledge about Afghanistan and its women, as if this alone could provide an adequate understanding of their suffering. So should burqa, veil, hijab alone provide an adequate understanding of the suffering of Afghani women? Is burqa equals oppression and no burqa appears freedom? So just like in Cromer's view, today as well, Islam is especially oppressive to women, and so perceptions of Muslim women continue to be haunted by the perceptions of Islam. Unless Islam becomes more respectable religion, Muslim women will continue to be oppressed, and aggressively oppressed, because they are Muslim. Conclusions from the Islamic society. For the Islamic societies, we must note that the trends of interpretation that we saw emerging from the earlier colonial period and the actors have persisted to this day. The position of women and visions of freedom for them is still, like it was then, tied to the way we perceive of Islam. No dialogue. I've already noted this. These three parties don't talk to one another. Absolutely. They just write literature, writing about the other, but not talking to one another. So no dialogue can possibly happen, because all sides refuse to admit even the concerns of the others. Ulama do not admit that there are new problems and times have changed. Either the prescriptions will change, or new and creative ways to implement religious prescriptions need to be thought over. Reformists do not even address the issue of moral corruption that modernization, pop culture, and uninhibited mixing has entailed, things that Sheikh Qardawi has pointed out. Both ulama and reformists can also admit that the concerns that give rise to Islam, hijab, scarf as part of Muslim identity, and as a reaction to perceived burgeoning isolation and disempowerment of Muslim moral and cultural norms that is feared by hardliners, are valid and can be discussed. The issue of cultural and religious authenticity would be at the forefront of this debate for a majority of people. That reformist discourse is not indigenous, culturally foreign, and has been continuously influenced and shaped by changing categories of discourse about women in the West is more than obvious, and of course a problem. More importantly, generally speaking, and excluding the extreme liberal and extreme hardliners, our society, parents, and even youth share concerns of all three camps. Muslims in general do not want to be dictated by the West, do not want to be morally corrupt, want to be pious, and want to look contemporary, progressive, and not schizophrenic from the world in which they operate. No one perspective fully covers and addresses these concerns. The inadequacy of the respective solutions can be and should be admitted frankly, and should result in constructive dialogue. In sum, all I'm saying is, let's depoliticize the issue. If it's not about women, let's not call it about women. The real problems exist, and they need sorting without these ideological commitments. Let's pay concrete attention to the concrete conditions of Muslim women, their day-to-day problems and particular social context. Our defense of our Islam and culture should not veil from us the problems of our community. By depoliticization of discourse, hopefully we will be able to go beyond the veil, which is Fatma Manisi's book title. All right, thank you.
Inshallah, next year, by this time next year, we'll be able to call him Dr. Rizwan. And I think what he ended his presentation with is that we have dominant established ways of talking about a given issue, and those dominant ways are actually hiding an important part of reality, maybe the most important part of reality, rather than uncovering it. That if we are to really, if we're really interested in dealing with reality, we have to stop thinking in these established patterns, outside of these established patterns. We have about 20 minutes. 25 minutes, and what I would like to do is just open up the floor to any questions you may have to either of our two presenters. Please.
I have a question about this one. You're basically talking about the demonization of Islam and by the West, and how women became the face of that demonization of Islam. I mean, I personally, as a woman, I think I am very grateful to all the suicide bombers, because I think they've taken the focus away from women, you know, as the face of Islam, to now men as the face of Islam. You ended with your quote, Fatma Manisi's quote, that we will not, I didn't get the exact quote, but we will not get rid of the veil until we depoliticize the issue of women. So in your opinion, how do we do that? Because I think all women are absolutely sick and tired of being the focus of men's insecurities and their debates, and I mean, it's always a larger issue, but it's always the women which get caught into the issue.
Materialize that if these three camps could talk to one another, because I think they all have valid concerns. Now their positions, hermeneutical method, attitude towards the tradition might not be right, but these three groups have to talk to one another, these three different ways, and of course that would include women as well, but not talking to one another on the one hand. And the second issue is that to depoliticize the whole debate, we have to ignore the West for a while, because they'll do what they do. I mean, there's no way we can counter their media. I mean, you've seen National Geographic's, that issue that came on Islam with all the women covered, veiled. If our concern is to give a better face of Islam or Muslim societies to the West, I don't think that's a good move. So we have to pay attention to our concrete realities. That's the kind of point I'm trying to make. But I don't know in how this can happen. I really haven't.
Reaction that whenever we are insecure, we become defensive, and when we become defensive, since our back is pushed against the wall, we stop thinking, and then we sort of reiterate what we believe in or what we are saying. So this we saw in during partition, the what you call them, the progressives versus the conservatives. The progressive Muslims said that let the women out, and let them not wear the veil, and let them be educated, and let them have the vote. whereas the Islamist says, no, 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 you know, women are our honor, they are the honor of our nation, they are the honor of our religion and all of that. So, I mean, I think that sort of hardening of position, that hardening of the conservative position, I think that is what has been sort of steadily growing and growing and growing, and now that we see Taliban. So that debate is no longer you know, between Muslims and non-Muslims, but it's amongst Muslims themselves. And I think we find that debate, as women, we find that debate extremely painful, because I mean, you want to be a good Muslim man, go ahead and do the things that God has asked you to do. Leave us alone, you know. We are answerable to God in our own right. He's not going to ask you whether, you know, we are going to go to heaven or hell. So, you know, I think it's time that, you know, women should have the space to be who they want to be.
I mean, internal debate, I mean, the one thing that I was trying to highlight, that is, this is not really an internal debate. With that upper class, westernized Muslims from the beginning to be part of the discourse, this discourse is always tied to the Western discourse about Muslims and Muslim women. And the other thing with the fundamentalists, what you have highlighted is the fundamentalism. What we fail to understand is the dialectic between the liberal and the fundamentalist. Liberal, as they turn liberal, as society starts turning liberal, there's a more reaction from the fundamentalists. As society starts turning fundamentalist, there's more reaction from the liberals. So they are reacting to one another, in which we are all suffering. And this is just one domain, which is Muslim women. Then you have the issue of terrorism and all of those other issues. But increasing I say like the dupatta Islam getting lost, and what you have is like headscarf on the one hand, or something of that, or sometimes like, you know, the Saudi jalabiyas and whatnot. And on the other hand, completely liberal Western, like people who are, I don't know what they are doing in this country. They would rather be in the West itself. So this that dialectic which is calling the problem.
ठीक है, नहीं बैठ कर लें. If you picked up the historical trajectory, right, when Rizwan began his presentation, it's interesting how Lord Cromer comes before Qasim Amin. Qasim Amin, it looks like, doesn't have a brain of his own. All of the terminology, all of the examples, all of everything that he's using is spoon-fed to him by the Lord Cromer camp. And again, वो backwardness and forwardness की बात होती है. Maybe the religious Muslims are backward. That's debate. That we can have a debate on that. What is undebatable is the secular elites in Muslim society are definitely backwards. That can be empirically proven, because अब देख लें, अभी terrorism की बात हो रही है ना. The phrase war on terrorism has dropped from the American and British official diplomatic language. They have made a policy decision that we will no longer use this phrase. The phrase war on terrorism, you will no longer hear it from the people who originated this. Where do you hear it repeated again and again and again? कौन इस phrase को अभी तक use कर रहे हैं? Right? It's the secular elite in Pakistan who are still using this phrase. So इनकी अपनी they have no language of their own. I have not come across a Desi liberal who has an idea which is original. It's all second hand and third hand. So even if we want to have a debate that's completely internal, and Rizwan has stated this a number of times, it is very, very difficult to keep it internal because of this the external influence.
I just want to reiterate that point, that what you have is Lord Cromer pointing out veiling, segregation, polygamy. And what we are getting today in 2007 is again the three issues. So the agenda, the tone of the debate was set by Lord Cromer. So what I mean by depoliticization, can we talk, I mean, and not worry about, because this was the whole point of the paper, that how come, I mean, I think it would be a more interesting paper. How were we able to sustain a discourse for 150 years on three categories, which were not even set up by us? That's what I mean. And then as the language of feminism has changed, so the Muslim feminism has changed. And so if they are always the partners, then I mean you can't really depoliticize it.
And the other thing is, it's
I'm sorry, my point was that men have a very, very important vital role to play in this. That's what my point was. That our men have a very vital role to play because they are the ones who are constantly, feeding off the Western, discourse. So they are the ones, I think to a very large extent, the resolving of the issue lies in their hands, how they deal with that problem.
May I?
Please.
Pass this up? I think this is a very, very sensitive matter, and it evokes different emotional responses because, obviously half of the society are women, and women's oppression is neither acceptable to neither nor to men. One thing I think that should be conceptualized in this discussion is that women should not be seen separately from the society as a special category. We all, old women, men, children, what have you, all of us, we're components of the society, and women are part of men and the men are part of women. The question is, we have to ask a very crucial one: why did the feminist movement start in the West? Is it because it was the Muslim woman or the Hindu woman or the Chinese woman intellectually deficient, or was she genetically, did she have 45 chromosomes? I think that's not the issue. The crucial issue is that the feminist movement in the West, it coincided with the secularization of the society, in a society that became belligerent towards heavens. And it was the man's rebellions against the heavens which followed the woman's rebellion against the man. And so it was not the woman of the pontifical man who rebelled. It was a woman of the Promethean man who rebelled. And so this Prometheanism has been cast over by seduction and by force over traditional societies that has actually artificially induced and taken women away from us, in a sense that they have sort of been presented as a special category, as if they were cattle or something, and which is why the woman has become angry. So this anger has been exogenously introduced into the woman, and the Muslim woman has been pitted against, and not only Muslim, the African, the Chinese, and so forth, all the other ones. So we have to look at exactly what has, there are metaphysical reasons, we have to ask the question, who is actually a woman? Mm-hmm. Who is a human? Are we now products of evolution, and it was just an accident that we became men and women, and maybe after a few million years we become hermaphrodites? I don't think that is the case. It is the determination, sex is biologically determined. Part of gender is socially constructed, but it is also spiritually ordained. The man's side is premised on the absolute side of God, and a woman's spiritual nature is premised on the infinitude of God. And so it is that symbiotic relationship that has been destroyed by secularism, and I think we have to sort of go back and visit that debate. Thanks.
Thank you. आपने कुछ कहना था? आपने कुछ कहना?
In terms of discourse analysis, I don't see how you're taking it a step forward, because what you say after Sabah Mahmood, I do not understand. And how can you say that depoliticizing? Yes, women's oppression is part of the colonial discourse. It continues to this day. So how can you talk about depoliticization? You're located in the US, in a university, you're contesting this. Is that not political? In this time and age, the fact that women's issues are not Islamic issues, they can be culturally contextualized. What I'm saying is, one, I find that the paper doesn't take one step beyond. Just to say that people need to talk to each other is a little,
That's precisely my response, that if you look at this discourse for 150 years, three parties are talking, right? Restating their position. And continue to restate their position with the same force. And nothing happens. Or not nothing happens, more confusion happens. Basically. So what do we say to that? So I was really, I don't see, it's neither my speciality nor my mission to describe something, but to highlight that something is seriously wrong with the way we are talking about and thinking about it. We have to change these categories. So that's all I'm trying to do. It's a kind of a, I don't think, I have something more to say because both the cultural context, political context, there's so many other variables. But from, as I said, this example of a scarce school, we open in a smaller city like Seattle, it speaks magnitude about where we are. It's the impact of this discourse which is resulting into complete problems. And these positions are now lived positions. They're not like few intellectuals talking. They have complete ramifications. I don't know what to say.
Okay, but I'm saying what I'm saying is to be politically much more challenging, politically or whatever, academically more challenging. If you were looking at, for instance, even historically at what Sayyid Ahmad Khan was saying,